The Furies, by Elton Gar. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm Uthon. He had run until the Furies quieted, then slowly ceased screaming. He then slowed to a walk. If he went 10 miles, he might have a week or two before they returned. But before he walked another mile, he saw a woman who looked almost exactly like his sister. He had traveled across the world for years and seen no one who could match his sister's beauty, until now. She was a tall woman with blonde hair blowing in the wind. The setting sun behind her shone through her white dress, making her look like an angel. How was it possible that anyone would let a woman that perfect work in an orchard? Uthon was exhausted, so he leaned against an oak tree and watched her work. She glanced in his direction twice, but was as bound by tradition as he was. The only place he could respectfully speak to her, without an introduction from a male member of her family, was in the church. After a 5-minute break, Uthon began to walk again, but only to the next village. He would stay here as long as the Furies allowed. The village was a wide spot in the road, with a tiny stone church and 5 small wooden houses, all surrounded by the trees of the large orchard. Uthon sat in the church's shadow, until a man came out of one of the wooden homes. Seeing Uthon, he removed the round black hat, which covered his thinning hair. A sign of respect Uthon would have reciprocated, but he had lost his hat a month ago and couldn't afford another. "I am Crathon. Your presence in my home would honor me." "Sadly, I have no work," the balding man said as he returned his hat to his head. That was tradition as well. The church required people to give aid to travelers, and it was bad manners to allow a guest to work, but Uthon needed to work. Hard work kept the Furies away longer. "I grew up near an orchard. I can prepare food or pick fruit," Uthon said. He tried not to think about the girl who looked like his sister, but he couldn't help wanting to meet her. "Picking fruit is woman's work. Men work in the fields or hunt," Crathon said. "I can haul rocks," Uthon said. He had noticed several piles of stones on the side of the road. The winter's frost would have pulled many rocks to the surface, and they would want to move those before the next year. Crathon looked at him carefully, then said, "It would be dishonorable to have a traveler do work I am unwilling to do. I will come with you." While Crathon readied the cart, Uthon thought about the girl. Was this her father? It was a small village, so it seemed possible, but he didn't ask. Even acknowledging he had seen her would break custom. Uthon knew the next 10 minutes well. Honor dictated Crathon's help, but after they lifted the few rocks too big for one person to get themselves, Uthon said, "I would not want to take you from your work." Crathon smiled. "I should be home when my daughter returns." "You have no wife?" Uthon asked, and immediately regretted it. If the man wanted to talk about it, he would have. "She died in childbirth." Uthon knew it was rude, but since the man had mentioned his daughter, Uthon asked, "Is your daughter the girl in the orchard?" Crathon's eyes narrowed. "Did you speak to her?" "Of course not. She was working in the orchard along the road into town," Uthon said, looking away as he spoke, because he had allowed his emotions to overcome his manners. Crathon nodded and walked back towards the town, leaving Uthon with the wagon. Uthon continued to pile rocks onto it, until the sweat was dripping off his chin. His mind foggy from exhaustion, Uthon carelessly reached under a large flat rock without looking. A sharp pain struck his hand. He jerked back as he saw the snake. He wanted to run back to the village, but calmed himself. He couldn't afford to rush. That would speed the poison, and he couldn't let his blood touch earth. Blood summoned the Furies. So he crawled slowly into the wagon as his hand began to throb. He grabbed the ropes, barely able to snap them once, and the mule followed the path it had walked down 1,000 times and stopped in front of the house, waiting to be freed from the load it was pulling. As he lay there, unable to pull himself forward, he saw the young woman carrying a basket of fruit. She could have easily assumed the mule had just walked away from the stranger, but she approached the wagon. According to every custom, that was the wrong thing to do. She should have summoned her father. It would dishonor the entire village for her to speak to the stranger without a proper introduction. But she approached, and once she knew he was injured, the rules changed. Allowing a guest in their house to die because she didn't help him was equally wrong. He was barely conscious, and she leaned down next to him, ignoring her honor, and asked, "What happened?" His eyes slid shut, and he lifted his hand. It had swelled up, but the snakebite was clear. She fumbled for her knife and made an X incision across the wound. Blood and venom flowed out and through the wagon's boards and dripped onto the ground as she ran to get her father. "You didn't speak to him, did you?" Crathon asked as he tied a rag tightly around Uthon's wrist above the bite. She had already told him she hadn't, but he had to be certain. The village's honor was at stake. "Not a word," Serena lied. Uthon's eyes opened, and he saw the ceiling of a building. The last thing he remembered was his sister's face hovering over him. Except it hadn't been his sister, it had been the woman who looked like her. He tried to sit up but couldn't. He tried to speak, but the furies began to shout, making it almost impossible to focus. "Murderer," the first invisible voice screeched. "They are sinners," the second shouted. "Kill them," the third said. Uthon wanted to believe the furies were a punishment, but he really didn't understand. They tormented him for killing, but they told him to kill. He was just glad they couldn't control him directly. They could only force him to flee, except the snakebite had made him too weak to flee. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the furies, who continued to shout, only going silent when Crathen arrived. "My daughter has returned. This is Serena," Crathen said, and she walked in. She wore a brown woolen dress far more reserved than what she had worn in the field, but her beauty lit the room. "It is a pleasure to meet you," Serena said. Uthon couldn't speak. There were multiple acceptable responses, all of which would affect their relationship considerably. "My fields, my livestock, my children, my family, and my life are at your service," he said. It was the most lavish greeting Uthon could give without overstepping his bounds, but she had saved his life and it was all he had to give in return. Both Crathen and Serena stepped back. Serena's face turned red. The greeting was what he would use for a queen or king. "Sir, I am inclined to accredit those words to your injury," Crathen said. Uthon could take it back, and everyone would ignore what he said. "Ignore them as you wish. They remain true," Uthon said. He hadn't had the chance to speak formally since the furies had forced him to flee. He enjoyed it. Crathen turned and walked out of the room, but Serena stayed, standing at the edge of his bed until Uthon said, "Do you think he's upset?" Serena's laugh was as beautiful and kind as his sister's had been. "You should rebuff me," Uthon said. He wanted the best for her, not a life of fleeing the furies. "I don't understand you, but I think I'd like to," Serena said. She then turned and walked out. As soon as she was out of the room, the furies returned, their voices joined by flickers of movement in the corners of his eyes. "He hates you," the first fury whispered. There were times the voice was almost kind, which was why the attacks cut so deep. "Let him kill you," the second cried. Of the three, she most hated Uthon. "Kill them before they kill you," the third whispered into his ear. After another 5 minutes of listening to the furies, he gathered enough strength to push away the thick blankets and pull his legs over the edge of the bed. His hand throbbed and had 2 deep gashes that would make any work difficult for some time, but they had saved his life. His arm hung limply as he pushed himself to his feet, and he had to put it into his shirt to hold it steady before he tried to walk. In the doorway of the small room, he slumped against the wall, too tired to continue, but even that far gave him a few seconds respite from the furies. "You need to rest," Serena said as she saw him in the doorway. While she spoke, she took a long strip of cloth and tied a makeshift sling so his arm was better supported. "I'll be fine," Uthon said, but the only thing holding him up was the wall. "You need a week's bed rest," Crathen said. The furies were right, he didn't like Uthon, but he had a responsibility to protect a guest in his house. Uthon did his best to ignore the furies, but he had seen the faded images. And along with them, he began to see the visions that came with the furies. In the vision, he saw his home when his sister and parents were alive. His father powerful both in stature and position. His mother regal, in the most literal sense of the word. His sister was too young to be called beautiful, but everything that would make her beautiful could be seen if you looked for it. His world had been beautiful and easy, but the furies' vision showed him that beauty only so that it could torment him by taking it away. It swished to darkness, and everyone he had ever known hung from those trees that were no longer huge trees filled with fruit, but instead twisted and dead branches. As he watched, the nearest of the bodies became Serena, her face turning red as she hung by the rope. Unable to withstand the furies' mental assault any longer, Uthon pushed himself away from the wall. His head spun, but he took a slow sliding step forward, then fell to one knee without the strength to argue when Crathen who dragged him back to the bed, and after a few minutes of listening to the furies, Uthon fell asleep. He woke several times, and the furies continued to torment him, shouting for him to kill or torture everyone and burn the house. The people here were evil, and if Uthon would do what the furies asked just this once, he would be free of them forever. Uthon tried not to believe them. The furies lied all the time, but even if it was the truth, it didn't matter. Uthon could barely stand. He couldn't do as they wished. Crathen walked into the room as Uthon fought to ignore the furies. I have to leave," Uthon said before Crathen had time to say anything. "You were yelling in your sleep. Tell me what is going on," Crathen said, and Uthon knew he wouldn't just let him go. He knew something was wrong now, and Crathen wasn't the type to just pass his problems off to someone else. The two men looked into each other's eyes, but Uthon looked away first and said, "Furies." Crathon didn't act surprised. He must have already suspected, and that meant he knew he had a murderer in his house. Uthon's face flushed under the shame of admitting to the Furies attacking him since they only followed the guilty. I must go. They leave me alone as long as I keep moving. So you run forever? That's not a solution. This time you nearly got caught. What if next time you break a leg or are put in jail? You could hurt someone, Crathon said. I can't fight them, Uthon said. They feed off guilt. If you face what happened, they'll get weaker, Crathon said. I am guilty, Uthon said. What did you do? Serena asked. I stayed when I should have left, Uthon said. It was all he could say. Tell me the whole story, Crathon said. My mother died when I was 12. My father was killed in the War of the Thorns. My sister raised me after that, Uthon said. It was a story that everyone in the kingdom knew, but he wasn't the only one who lost parents, and many died in the War of the Thorns, so they might not put the full story together. Go on, Crathon said when Uthon stopped talking, though he could barely hear him over the Furies who were screeching and swooping around him. They didn't like what he was saying. My sister took me and fled our home, but if it wasn't for me, she could have married and left our shame behind. She hated me because of that. She was poor and defenseless, and it was because of me. Then what happened? Every day she got more angry. She came in one day. Her dress was torn and there was a bruise on her wrist. She was angry and wouldn't stop screaming at me. Then she started to slap me. I had to stop her, Uthon said. Keep going, Crathon said, as Uthon stopped and began to rock back and forth on the floor trying to drive back the thoughts. The Furies screeched louder and launched themselves at him. He could feel them bouncing off his skin now, but they were still barely there. I was nearly an adult by them, 13 and as tall as her. I shoved her to get her to stop. She fell and hit her head. I ran and the next day the Furies came, Uthon said. The Furies slowed, and they became clearer than before. The first face was his father, twisted into an angry scream. The second was his mother, her hair white and flying in every direction. The third was his sister, her body covered with flames. Kill him now and you'll be free, his sister said. The sound of fire crackled in her voice, and he was tempted to follow the order. He was already a murderer. You don't want to hurt anyone. You never did. You have to believe that, Crathon said, and he looked around the room. Uthon wondered if he could hear the voices. They tell me that if I kill for them, they will free me. Will it work? Uthon asked. They feed on guilt. Killing someone would make you a better meal for them. Would any animal leave when someone fed them so well? Crathon asked. Uthon stood slowly, and the Fury that was his sister laughed. The other two Furies seemed disinterested. To them, he was simply an object to torture, a way to feed. He considered taking the chance for a moment. What if he could earn his freedom with 2 blows? Will you do it? Serena asked. I have to be free of them, Uthon said. Kill her. She's evil. She's worse than him, his sister screamed. Uthon stood and grabbed the chair next to the bed to avoid falling. The Furies were trying to control him, but he would kill himself before he allowed Serena to be killed. But the Furies were still trying to control him. Once stable, he lifted the chair and swung downward. Serena could have moved away. She was far faster than him in this condition, but she only watched him. At the last second, he twisted the chair so it missed Serena by inches and struck at the Fury. He expected it to slide through the Fury, but he felt the resistance against the chair. In their need to hurt people, the Furies had allowed themselves to become too real. The Fury flew at him, striking at him. The blow was soft, like being hit with a pillow, but their weight was growing, and he was weak, so even that weight was enough to knock him off balance, and he fell backward. Before he could push himself to his feet, the Fury landed on his chest. The bruises from the night he had killed his sister still marked her face, but it was the misery of her life, not her death, that he saw most clearly. She blamed him for all of it. The death of their mother, the war for succession, and the desperation as she hid him. Uthon crawled backward, kicking at the Fury on his skin, burning wherever she touched him. She had never been this strong before, and he had some hope she might kill him this time. Then he couldn't hurt anyone else. You have to fight this, Crathon said. Uthon pushed himself to his feet, beginning to understand. He had never escaped the Furies, and he certainly hadn't outrun them for days or weeks at a time. They had let him go. Running only kept him from confronting the guilt. And that guilt strengthened them, and he should feel guilty. He was a murderer, but if he didn't want to kill again, he had to fight them. As he stepped forward, his sister became real. Only the fire that surrounded her remained to remind him she wasn't his sister. But he knew it wasn't her. She was just a creature that had taken the form of his sister to torment him. She attacked, slapping him like she did that day, and he was forced to grab her arms. Flames burned his hands, but the flames, while painful, were an illusion, so he didn't let go or shove her away. It was time to face the pain. Images flooded his mind as they struggled. He saw their father hitting her and her protecting him. He also saw how happy she had been when their father died in the war. The war had started because he was a terrible man, but Uthon had been too young to fully understand that. The next image was of his mother. She appeared exhausted as the day she had died, yet her smile reminded him of the best days of his life. But as much as his mother had loved him, she had hated his sister. If she had been a boy, then there likely would not have been a war. Her husband wouldn't have died. Even now, if she married, it would make things worse for everyone except his sister. Uthon and his mother likely would have been killed to eliminate any other claims to the throne. And yet, as he had seen the bruises and scratches on his sister, he had let her lie to him. Let her tell him she was just clumsy. How many times, he asked, his voice cracking while his hands burned. Hundreds of images surrounded him, their mother hitting her in the orchard that sat in the courtyard, in their palace in front of the staff, even in the city square. Uthon didn't want to believe his mother had treated his sister so badly, but he knew the images were true. I protected you, then when you didn't need me anymore you killed me, the fury that was his sister said, and the surrounding flames grew hotter. I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't, he cried. The creature grew weaker, and he knew he could push her away, but he didn't. Instead, he twisted her arm behind her back as he had done when they wrestled as children. You hid from pain as a child. Everyone does. All you can do now is face that, Crathon said. He must know who Uthon was now, but he hadn't said anything. The fire covered him, and the pain of the fire mixed with the snake venom that was still weakening him. But worse than either was the understanding of how much his sister had suffered to protect him, and he had repaid that by hurting her just like everyone else. Then the other furies attacked. They took the images of his parents, and he saw their history in those attacks. He could see images of his grandparents teaching his mother how to act by striking her, saw his grandfather put a knife to his father's throat. He could see the battle their father had died in, and his mother's deathbed. He even saw the cup that held the poison. He wondered if that poison had been to kill the Queen Regent, or kill an abusive mother. He didn't know if it mattered. What does it mean? Uthon asked, unable to understand even a fraction of the pain that they tried to show him. They want you to believe their pain gave them the right to hurt you, but that your pain doesn't allow you 1 minute of anger, Crathon said. I murdered her. I didn't have any furies telling me what to do, or trying to control me. She hit me and I was angry, so I killed her. How can I forgive that? You were 13 and abused. And even with the stories that were spread, most of us know it was an accident. You might have willingly hurt her, but you didn't want her to die. And you can't undo any of that pain. All you can do is make decisions that keep things from getting worse. Allow yourself to be angry at them for hurting you. Then forgive them for being broken people and finally do the same for yourself, the old man said. I forgave my sister a long time ago, Uthon said as he looked at his sister and the flames stopped. She had only slapped him a few times and had protected him far more often. And the others? Who am I to forgive people for things they did to someone else? Uthon responded, and the flames grew around them. You're the only one left, Crathon said. I forgive them for what is mine to forgive, Uthon said. He was too tired to be angry. The creature was barely burning at all now, though it was still an effort of will to hold it. Yet the furies remained. They won't leave until you give it all up, Crathon said. Uthon looked at Crathon, then at the furies. He didn't want to forgive himself, because that might mean he could do it again. What if I'm like my family? What if I hurt someone else? Uthon asked. You resisted when the furies were trying to make you hurt someone. Why would you hurt someone when they weren't? Crathon asked. Uthon closed his eyes, forgetting everything. Forgetting the hopes he had for the future, for Serena and this small village. He never wanted to leave. I forgive myself. When he opened his eyes, the furies were gone. The world was open to any possibility. He could claim his father's throne, raise an army and get people killed, and start this all over again. Or he could stay here, in a quiet village. And as he looked at Serena, he knew there was only one answer. He smiled for the first time in years, and then fell into a long, calm sleep. Author's note: I enjoy stories about monsters as well as mythology, but it can be hard to find a story with monsters that haven't been in a ton of things I've read. And while I'm certain that there are other stories with the furies, I felt like I could create something interesting. In the earlier drafts, Uthon was a poor man racked with guilt. I added the nobility into the story because I feel it's important to remember that just because people look respectable and are rich that doesn't mean they can't be hurting or hurt people. And because of the understanding of who his father and his family was, I felt no need to resolve the story with any attempt for him to regain his power. His father was a monster who was deposed for that, and the kingdom is better for having a different king. This story is far darker than what I usually write, but I think it turned out well. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.anscifi.com. Just follow the link that says free book. Or you can get access to all of my short stories, including Patreon exclusives and audio versions of some of the stories, by becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Elton. Thanks. Elton Gar.